You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
So I've really spent the last 10, 15 years of my career as an investor and operator in Africa. And I've really tried to move this ecosystem, but really the continent forward through working and investing. There's all these fees and customer service issues and challenges that are actually predatory for the most disadvantaged and most vulnerable users to be part of the banking system. Let's be humble but curious thought partners and then collaborators, both with our portfolio companies, but with the ecosystem as a whole. But really, it's like, can you get up off the mat? Can you show up every day with enthusiasm, energy, and positivity to make things happen?
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find inspirational people who are doing inspirational things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have Efayomi Carr, who is principal at Flourish Ventures and has worked with startups and scaleups on the African continent for the last decade, gaining unique insights into Africa's innovation and startup landscape. Welcome to the podcast, Efayomi. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. And yes, I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Me too. So where are you at the moment?
Yeah, so I'm actually in Nairobi at the moment. I'm originally from Sierra Leone, so I was in Sierra Leone these past couple of weeks, but got back to Nairobi yesterday. And so it's nice to be back. So where I'm usually based.
Fantastic. So I'm looking forward to hearing what took you to Sierra Leone and what you're currently doing in Nairobi. So to get us started, introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Efayomi Carr.
Yeah, okay. So I've really spent the last 10, 15 years of my career as an investor and operator in Africa. And I've really tried in my own small way to move this ecosystem, but really the continent forward through working and investing. And so I've worked as an operator, folks like Jumia. I was at Lowry Systems, even was consulting for a while at BCG and worked as a Sierra Leone government for some time as well. But most recently, obviously, I worked as an investor. So at Flourish now, worked at Quona Capital, another fintech-focused investment fund, and another fund called 8 Miles, which is a private equity shop. So yeah, a few different roles across in investing, operating in Africa.
Fantastic. So as you mentioned, last 10 to 15 years, you've worked as an investor and operator within an array of quite established organizations and companies, which has led you to what you're doing now at Flourish Ventures. So can you tell us a bit more about Flourish Ventures, in particular in terms of its missions and goals within Africa's innovation or startup landscape?
Absolutely. And Flourish is a bit of a unique venture fund. We are headquartered in Silicon Valley, so we're headquartered in San Francisco. But we invest globally. So we have teams investing in US, Latin America, India, Southeast Asia, and then obviously Africa, where I'm focused. And despite having these broad geographies represented, there is a core mission, which is to not just invest in fintech companies that we think can be commercially successful, but also work with entrepreneurs that are building towards a more fair financial system. What that means in different geographies and contexts can be different. But, across Africa, we have a very underserved population when it comes to banking services and access to fair financial practices. And so a lot of the work we do in Africa is to support customers and merchants to enable them to have access to financial tools that will improve their lives and have a meaningful impact on their day-to-day work.
I've seen Flourish Ventures described as a fintech venture fund with a purpose. Could you kind of explain or elaborate on what that purpose is?
Absolutely. The purpose is, how can we work with entrepreneurs, enable them to build a more fair financial system across the world? And I think oftentimes the best way to describe our work is to describe the work of the folks we work with.
Yes.
And so I always love to describe the work that our companies do, right? Like we invested in Apollo Agriculture as an example. And their company provides loans to farmers across Kenya and Zambia. And today, it's very hard for farmers, smallholder farmers, to access financial services. So they build this broad distribution network and product that allows them to serve this group of people who, until very recently, haven't had these type of resources. It means they haven't been able to grow their businesses. They haven't been able to have access to the right seed and fertilizer to improve yield and provide for their families. And so that sort of really sort of typifies the mission, which is, can we back innovative entrepreneurs, in this case, folks like Eli, who are doing things that change the financial system for the people who need it most in this world. And in this case, it's smallholder farmers. And so that kind of encapsulates what that purpose is and why we choose entrepreneurs that are very aligned with that purpose.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. So would you say that purpose is similar across all markets, or is there a specific purpose that is intrinsic to what you do within the African continent?
I would say that purpose very much is aligned across all markets, but how it actually works in practice might differ because the dynamics in these markets are so different. And that's also why we tend to take a thematic approach. So we might pick a particular subsector within fintech, and we might make bets globally. So an example I would say is neobanking or challenger banks. And this is really sort of startups or smaller companies who have developed new versions of banks and a way to compete with the existing banking system. And so we've made bets across the world. We've made bets in Neon, Brazil, Albo in Mexico, Fair Money in Nigeria, and in Chime in the US. And if you look at Chime's mission was, in the US, the banking sector is, overall, there's all these fees and customer service issues and challenges that are actually predatory for customers. And that makes it more difficult for the most disadvantaged and most vulnerable users to be part of the banking system. And so what Chime did is they said, we're going to build a profitable bank that doesn't have those same problems, right? That doesn't charge folks for, overdraft the same way that a larger institution might. And they have been incredibly successful. Not only have they been successful individually, but they've also changed the banking landscape. They forced the more traditional banks to change how they operate, to now service these other customers and to remove these fees. And so in the US context, this neo-banking thesis was really around disrupting an oppressive banking system that, because of the fees and charges, made it really difficult for the most underserved customers to participate fully. In Africa, it's a slightly different thesis, right? Fair Money has been able to build a business initially built on loans to customers and micro businesses and building that into a broader banking set. But the issue in Nigeria, the context was, it was really hard for those customers to get loans safely and for those loans to build them towards a more inclusive financial system as opposed to being actually more oppressive, things that will hold them down. And so Fair Money has also changed the banking system in Nigeria. It's allowed these small and micro businesses to not just access loans, but now, of course, Fair Money is a full neobank, so they get access to other banking services. And so I choose those two examples to illustrate how the mission drives our activities and what we choose to invest in. And it's aligned across geographies, though the actual thesis might be slightly different because of the challenges that folks face in those countries.
So I guess it's clear that Flourish is keen to invest in mission-driven entrepreneurs. So if you look away from the context of Africa, are there specific missions that Flourish is keen to support in Africa?
Yeah, frankly, it aligns with the purpose, right? So I think the missions that our entrepreneurs are working with are across a variety of challenges, right? I think part of the reason why it's, in my opinion, so exciting to work in Africa and so challenging and almost saddening to work in Africa and starting to work in Africa is it the same two sides of the same coin, which is so many of the system structures are actually underdeveloped, are poor. And that also means that there is incredible opportunities and that the impact that you can make from innovation is outsized here relative to other markets. And so when we think about what are the missions that our entrepreneurs support, it can be across such a range of categories. I've given you two examples of, access to loans and banking in Nigeria and farmers having access to new lending products and enabling them to grow their businesses in Kenya. But if we look across our other investments, we have things in blockchain, right? Allowing people to send and receive money cross-border in a seamless and cost-effective way. That can be transformative, right? In countries where people are so reliant on remittances. We invested in a company called Honeycoin that's doing that here in Kenya. If you look at in Egypt, we investors in Maxib, which is allowing merchants to access a whole range of tools and to make their operations more efficient. And this continent is ruled by these small merchants who supply so many of the goods. And so that mission is very, very different. It's working with a slightly different segment, but also using innovation to improve an entire business category and improve the lives of the businesses and customers they serve. And so, I think the missions that we support in Africa are really vast, and in a way that can be daunting, but also in a way it's so exciting to see how many types of people, types of companies we can support, and the range of impact that they can have in these different places.
Thank you for sharing that. I guess we've discussed investing in mission-driven entrepreneurs. We know that as an investor, there is a requirement for a return on investment when you have supported a startup or innovator or entrepreneur. But from your perspective, what does success look like when you're supporting or investing in a company? Is it all about profit, or is it a lot more behind that you look at in terms of the metrics?
Yeah, I think that there are two ways to look at success. And then I think there's almost like a philosophical approach that I prefer to use. So I'll give probably the two more conventional approaches, which is, I think, many organizations, taking a step back, many organizations in Africa, particularly Africa-focused investors, have some kind of impact or mission-driven approach. Oftentimes, it's dictated by their LPs, who in the African context tend to be, or there's a higher proportion of DFIs or government-related institutions / NGOs who have some kind of mandate that requires the investments to have impact. So I'll say that impact is one way to look at success. I'd say there's a traditional, there's some of these globally approved ways of looking at impact success metrics, which would be, things that are related to the UN SDGs, or, oftentimes, when I was at Kono, we have LPs that force us to sort of track the number of jobs created or lives touched or female entrepreneurs, et cetera. So I think those are some of the more traditional metrics that are used for impact. At Flourish, we have a very different approach, which is we try to look at the nuance of an individual business and see what the impact of our investment is on both a business, but also a sector. So I'll use the example I shared earlier with Chime. When we look at the impact of that investment, it's actually what has that done to the banking sector in the US? And in the US, what it's done is it's changed how fees are charged for all customers. So it's actually had this very broad impact on the banking sector and how customers are treated. That's how we look at impact, which is what is the tangible change in environment, a sector, or a business as a result of a company we've invested in. That's one bucket. Of course, the second bucket is commercial returns, which is, I think, the traditional way that success is viewed in venture. If you look at most venture firms or top bucket US, looking for 15, 20% plus returns as a strong outcome for a fund. We track ourselves across a very similar standpoint. So those are probably two high-level ways to look at impact. One is the impact of the investment. How meaningful is the change created as a result of our company's activity? And then the commercial returns, which is how much monetary value is created over the course of the investment. So those are kind of the traditional ways, I think, to think of success. I think as investors, we are very much in the people business. Like let's be real. Like my role isn't necessarily to change a business. I'm here to support a board, a management team, to increase the likelihood that they achieve the best possible outcome for their businesses. So that's really what my job is as an investor. And of course, it's to provide insights and to network and to help with hiring, et cetera, and to have a fiduciary duty. But ultimately, it's, how am I supporting these people, these individuals, to help them be successful? And for me, I think there's a lot of different ways to look at it as well. And internally, we look at an NPS score, for example, to see how do our entrepreneurs rate us as investors on their cap table. Another way is the feedback that we receive from others in the ecosystem on the work that we're doing, how we're engaging as thought leaders or as partners in solving some of these really, really deep problems. And so almost from a philosophical standpoint, I really like to look at the inputs of my work, which is, how am I engaging with entrepreneurs? How deliberate am I being in my research? I try to wake up every day and say, if I can be two things, if I can do my job with curiosity and integrity, then I will have a successful day. And that means, integrity means honesty and humility, meaning, do I show up to every time I get pitched, do I show up with the mentality that I'm learning from this entrepreneur, right? I'm always learning from the work they're doing. And am I genuinely curious about the work they're doing? Am I digging deeper to hopefully by the questions I asked and by having a wider lens of experience, but definitely not as much focus as they do, I can ask the right questions that can push them to achieve something greater than they would otherwise. And so that's really how I try to approach this job and this work. And I think across our firm, there's a similar approach of let's be humble but curious thought partners and then collaborators, both with our portfolio companies, but with the ecosystem as a whole.
Thank you for sharing that. So if we look at, I guess, the commercial returns, but account for the ability to also innovate, which is what you're hoping a lot of the startups or entrepreneurs that you're supporting will be able to do. How would you say that you navigate the balance between allowing startups to innovate without the demand for immediate returns or profitability?
The venture capital industry exists essentially because for certain business models, they will not be able to achieve profitability for a while. And they need this period of losing money in order to create products and solutions that in the long term will be very highly scalable. In the most traditional sense, this works with software because software takes a lot of investment in order to get right. And then once you do get it right, and once you do hit a growth curve, then it's a high margin product. So you can make a lot of money. And as a result of that, you can make good returns to the initial investors. So that's why the venture model exists. If the businesses could make money on their own and could be profitable, then they shouldn't take venture capital money, frankly. That can juice their growth, but they should probably take debt capital, right? Which they can, and then retain all the equity on their cap table and be worth more. So VC is a model for folks who think that they have an idea that can be widely successful at scale, but before it reaches scale will be cash, it will burn a lot of cash. From an investor perspective, we need to be conscious of that. So my role as one of the hats is to identify companies to invest in. When I'm looking at these companies, I need to be able to assess what does the end game look like? What is at scale in 5 to 7 years, what will this company look like? What will the profitability look like? What is the competitive landscape? And so if I have a vision and hopefully is aligned with the founders and the management team's vision of what this company will look like in 5 to 7 years, then being patient, being level-headed early days is a requirement. That's its entire business, is to say this time is made to develop these ideas, product, and team such that once you reach the growth curve, you're in the best position to capture the value that we initially invested in. And so, I think for all investors in this space, that's the mentality we should approach the early days of loss-making businesses with.
Thank you for that. You touched on this earlier. If we look specifically at your approach, what value do you add to these startups or innovators outside of capital to enable them or give them the best chance of success?
Yeah, again, my main role is as an advisor. I think as an individual and as an institution, there's a lot that we bring to the table. I was an entrepreneur before this, and I think I had investors who were good. I had investors who were ambivalent, so did nothing. And I had investors who were bad, in the case, value destructive. And my first advice when I was an operator to investors was do no harm. If your activities are taking time, and actually inhibiting the growth or development of this business, then that is value destructive. And so I think first and foremost, if investors could do no harm, that in of itself would be great. Get out of the way of some of the entrepreneurs, let them work. I think where investors can be positive is where they can be, one, responsive, so accessible in a way that if folks need advice or even need support for just administrative tasks, that can be done without any hiccups. I think two, as strategic partners, strategic thinkers. And so again, I have many investors, the value that they have is that they might have more breadth and they might have a bit more experience, and as an individual, as an institution. And so many of the hurdles that entrepreneurs, in our portfolio are facing, they might be facing it for the first time, but across the 75 companies in our portfolio and the 25 people on our team, someone has probably experienced that before, or has access to someone who does. And so bringing the thought partnership and experience is incredibly valuable. It's often what founders really crave, is just having someone who's been in that position, give them a bit of counsel or just feedback. And then I think the other is actually to be, an ambassador. And this particularly applies when fundraising, but what role can I play in helping to curate financing? When there's hiring needs, how can I be active as a representative to identify people to hire them, et cetera, or to hire for their team, et cetera. And so I think those are really the main hats. I think overarching is do no harm. Make sure you're approaching your entrepreneurs with integrity and humility. And then as much as you can, try to leverage experience networks to be a strategic partner. And then when possible, act on behalf of the company in ways that are supportive of them.
You mentioned that you were an entrepreneur before this. So from your experience, what would you say are some common challenges or pitfalls that startup founders in Africa encounter on their journey towards business success?
How much time do we have?
Maybe just give me the top one or two.
I'll maybe talk about, because we always talk about, the challenges of talent or infrastructure, or one thing that I think is often understated, which is, honestly, pretty consistently the top challenge for a lot of folks that I interact with is just co-founder issues. So it can be a range of things, but this running a business is I've never been married, but I've been told it's like a marriage in the sense of the ups and downs, the challenges, and the various emotionally taxing experiences. And that doesn't always work out, as we know. And so I think the experiences that I think often cause founders the most stress, the most hardship, oftentimes relates to co-founder issues. And so I think, I always give the advice that, try to have some experience with your co-founder beforehand, right? Like there's certain ways that you can de-risk the co-founder relationship such that you can either have an additional experience or exposure to them, or you can set up the business in such a way that if things don't work out, that you both aren't sort of handicapped going forward. And so I think one thing that's not talked about often, but that we see time and again as one of the biggest challenges that founders face, is just issues with the co-founding team.
Interesting. And to be honest, that's one that I don't think is often shared or talked about enough. So is there any specific advice that you would give to founders to avoid this issue?
Yeah, again, I think can you de-risk it by having additional experience with the co-founder? So either have worked with them or do proper diligence on folks who have worked with them. And so that you have some understanding of a personality / mission alignment. How do you communicate with each other? How do you communicate your opportunities? How do you set up these systems so that when things are in a bad place, you guys can still come to a resolution? And then I guess 3 is how do you structure your cap table? Like different companies will have different shareholdings, investing schedules for founders, but there are ways to set these things up such that in the event of some fallout, again, you're not totally handicapped. So
if we move from the challenges and look at some of the successes that you've seen through the years, in your opinion, in terms of the founders that you have worked with, what would you say distinguishes the successful founders from those who struggle to achieve sustainable growth in their businesses?
Yeah, I think it's resilience, right? Every founder I know has been punched in the mouth time after time, and that's an inevitable part of the job. And so it's really around how can you recover from that? And then can you continue to push forward in the face of adversity? And so, yeah, I think it really. We just had our CEO retreat about a month ago, or a few weeks ago, and it's interesting having the portfolio in the same room because the profiles and personalities of the founders are so different. It would be impossible to say what character trait is most indicative of success. Some are extroverted, some are incredibly shy and introverted, some are very technical, some are super untechnical and it's great salesmen. There's very different qualities, but what is consistent is these guys have been down and gotten back up off the mat time and time again, and so that really is a great sign for success and continued success in this industry.
Brilliant. So you mentioned that resilience is key. So if we move from character traits and look specifically at skill sets, are these specific skill sets that you believe enable some entrepreneurs to succeed and others to fail?
Yeah, again, I don't want to say specific skill sets because again, I think there's such a range of skill sets. Like some are incredibly detail oriented and some are incredibly disorganized. Right. So and some are, I think overall, there are certain qualities that will be advantageous, right? Like if you are a great rallier of people, so if people are attracted to you and if you're able to inspire, then it's a good chance you'll be able to hire a team early on. It's a good chance you'll be able to sell a vision to investors early on. So that's a really valuable quality for an early stage founder. But I can say that there are some founders who are not great at that are also widely successful. So I hesitate too much at being too prescriptive about what one needs to be like in order to be successful. I will say the how, which is being really resilient, which is not taking no for an answer, which is running through brick walls. And so, and certainly I would also just add that at different stages, different traits are more valuable. So at the early stages, it's like, yeah, your storytelling, your rallying of people, you don't have much to go on. So if you can sell, then you can probably get a bit more early stage success. Later on, it's like you need to be a complete master of the business, right? And then even later than that, you maybe don't need to be a master of the business at all. Maybe you just need to be a public facing CEO who has this really creative, big thinker energy, as opposed to a sort of wartime CEO who knows the X's and O's of everything going on in the company. So I think for different types of companies and at different stages, there are different qualities that will be useful. But really, it's like, man, can you get up off the mat? Can you show up every day with enthusiasm, energy, and positivity to make things happen?
Brilliant. We've discussed some of the internal challenges, such as co-founder issues. If we look at, say, external challenges, from what you've observed, I know we are currently seeing a bit of a downturn in terms of global economic activity. Within Africa, are there any pressing challenges externally that you're seeing startups currently facing that they're having to navigate for long-term success and sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big ones that we've all seen are, macro challenges. If you're in Nigeria, or if you're in any of the big four markets, then you have had incredible currency volatility, supply chain disruption, inflation, et cetera. So for any of these markets, I think there is a huge macro risk that is ever present. I think, next one we talked about a lot is regulation. So a lot of these countries have sort of unclear regulation and standards are often opaque and changing. And so that can be difficult to navigate. And I think a third big one is just talent, right? I think, there's a huge young population on the continent, but not as big as far as the technical talent for scalable companies. And so if you need engineers and CFOs, et cetera, it's especially at scale, it can be hard to find some of that talent on the continent, frankly, especially when you get to a later stage and are in a globally competitive space. So those are probably the three challenges that come to mind. But man, there's the challenges these folks are facing every day are numerous.
I agree. So you touched on currency, regulation, and talent. At Flourish Ventures, how do you help the startups that you're investing in address or navigate some of these challenges in the market?
Yeah, I think I'll take each one, but for currency, for example, there's not much we can't control the currency. What we can do is advise strategies to hedge. What we can do is to advise on right transfer policies for internal transactions. So that's more of the how can we leverage experiences and networks in order to help support our entrepreneurs navigate these. And I think we do a decent job of that. I think similarly on the regulation, again, we can't influence, in some ways we can influence the regulators, but that's not our bread and butter. I think it's really helping them to navigate what are unclear landscapes. At time, we have actually invested directly in, policy sandboxes so that we can help craft regulation. But I'd say for our entrepreneurs, it's really just here's what we've seen, and here's ways that we think that you might be at risk / vulnerable in the future. And then I think for talent, we do a lot of work, to help people with hiring. And so I think we leverage our own networks. We work with headhunters. We're active in the interview process for sort of senior hires. And so with that, it's really how can we be a supportive recruitment network for some of these companies.
Interesting. So what lessons would you say you've learned from your experience over the last few years navigating some of the unique circumstances that you've encountered?
Yeah. I think one thing is patience. You mentioned earlier around, we're discussing the venture capital model and how there's challenges. Most companies are not going to have profitability early on, and then later on they can reach scale. And so I think it's really to have patience for these companies, especially in Africa. It just takes a while to build. There's a lot of infrastructure and pieces to put in place to be successful. So I think patience is really important. I think the entrepreneurial journey is so difficult, but also filled with such high highs and low lows that often being level-headed can be a real benefit to some of the entrepreneurs we work with. And so I would say maintaining composure is often really, really important. And then I think in general, these things are really hard. And so for me, it's having a deep level of compassion, empathy for the folks that I work with, understanding that they're constantly facing battles and crises. And so it's important that I recognize that, not that I'm sort of easy on them or that I in fact, don't treat them as adults, but more so that I'm aware of their circumstances and can act appropriately.
Would you say that these lessons or experiences have shaped your investment approach or strategies going forward?
Certainly. I think as we talked about, what qualities do we look for in entrepreneurs, I think looking for solving for their resilience, solving for spending more time to understand the motivations of a person and to see how that impacts the work that they're doing. So very much so, have over time evolved my own approach to specific entrepreneurs, but to this job as a whole, and then tried to revise my own values as an investor and as an advisor. So ensuring that I have patience, empathy, and some sort of level-headedness in the way that I engage with the entrepreneurs I'm already invested in. So very much. But I would hope that these things are always evolving, that if you ask me again 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I would have different answers of what I've learned and how it's shaping my strategies.
Looking forward in terms of this evolution and maybe some of the external trends going on in the space, are you seeing a change or a shift with regards to how people are evaluating the success or performance of companies in the African market?
In some ways, yeah. It goes back to it's kind of follow the money, right? So if 5-10 years ago, the LPs were more likely to be DFIs, and if now that's moving to more commercial capital, then the relative weight of sort of impact relative to commercial terms will decrease. And I think for this ecosystem to be successful in the long term, it really needs to be more commercially driven. So I think that's been one trend, though. I think with a lot of the climate money coming in, it's not necessarily tied to commercial returns. It's just too early for folks to have any good view on that. So I think that's starting to regress a bit. But I would say that had been the trend for the last 10 years, where when I first started doing this in 2012 and 2011, there wasn't there's a few funds, but mostly DFI, mostly impact and grant money. And so the success was, can you have impact? Can you sell a good story? And more that has been moving towards what are the core metrics of the business and what is the exit profile.
Thank you for that. So if we move from trends and look to the future, say in the next 5 years, where do you see the African startup ecosystem in terms of how success is measured?
Yeah, I mean, this is still a very early asset class. And where the rubber hits the road is when exits happen. And for a long time, we've been able to say it's too early to determine the overall success of this asset class because it's been we haven't enough exits. In 5 years' time, this will have been a 10, 15-year-old space. There needs to be some signs of exit. So I think investors won't stop investing on potential, but actually on realized returns, which will shift the landscape. It might mean that certain investors pull back from Africa. It might mean that other ones crowd in, right? So I think in 5 years, we'll be more rigid in how we'll have more data to determine, financially how lucrative is this asset class, which will determine the scale of capital that's coming into the market.
So if we look closer to home, where do you see yourself and Flourish Ventures in 5 years' time?
Hopefully still supporting entrepreneurs in some way, shape, or form. I think, we raised, got new capital for another fund cycle back last year. And so, between now and 5 years, if we have success, if we continue to identify great companies and we can help support them to be successful, then hopefully we can raise capital again in the next few years and continue to do this work for a bit longer.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Okay, a proverb. There's something we say, what's the size of stone, no feather in? It's like a waterside stone is not afraid of rain, right? Like if you're a stone by the ocean, you won't be afraid of getting wet because you're always wet. And I think it's a mentality that has served me in the past as an entrepreneur. And I think it's something that it resonates with the entrepreneurs I work with, right? Because at the end of the day, you're in the fire. The very nature, the crux, the core spirit of this work is that we are putting ourselves our entrepreneurs are putting themselves in very vulnerable positions, trying to do something that's never been done. And in order to do that, they need to go up against thresholds and often cross those thresholds and get burned. And so if the nature of the work is to be by the ocean and to be as close as you can so that you can push the shore out a little bit further, just so that the people behind you can push it a little bit further, right? So that's the nature of it. Yeah. And we shouldn't be getting wet because we're going to get wet all the time. And so, so that always has resonated with me. And at those moments when I have gotten wet or I've gotten burned or whatever it might be, I've said, this is the position I put myself in, and I knew this was part of the job. And I'm happy that means I'm still pushing these barriers. So this isn't a cause for me to be discouraged, but a cause for me to be reinvigorated that I'm doing what I'm supposed to.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. It's actually one that I've never heard before, but extremely profound. And I guess it's in line with the work that you're doing and the spirit of entrepreneurship and business and investing in Africa. So yeah, I like that one.
Yeah, well, I just spent 2 weeks with my uncles and they got a whole list of proverbs that you probably never heard of. So, keep going if you need to.
Yes, I know. Brilliant. So, Efayomi, we've come to the end of today's conversation. I was wondering, do you have any closing remarks, calls to action for people who are interested in the work that you're doing at Flourish Ventures?
The only call to action would be what we're doing is really hard, and we're hoping to change the continent and the world and make it better. And so truly, we should all have grace for ourselves for what we're doing. And we should do this with people that we want to work with. Like at the end of the day, we're going to spend long hours and really tense moments. Me, myself, and I think my colleagues at Flourish, we love working with entrepreneurs. And it's because of the passion and integrity that we have across our portfolio. And so I love building. I think in it or out of my day job, that's the goal. And working with great people is really what makes me happy. So just keep your head up.
Wise words. So thank you for sharing your perspective, I guess, on the importance of diverse metrics for success, navigating challenges. It's been a pleasure having you on the show, and thank you for your time and expertise.
My absolute pleasure. And thank you for the great questions, and ready for part 2 anytime. I'll come up with some more proverbs.
Brilliant. I look forward to that.
Cheers.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.